My name is Josh, and this happened when I was 30 years old, though I still remember every detail vividly. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, a place surrounded by endless forests. My younger brother, Ethan, and I spent most of our childhood playing in the woods behind our house. When I was 12 and he was 10, our dad built us a treehouse. Nothing fancy, just a wooden platform with a roof, a few walls, and a rickety ladder leading up to it. But to us, it was our own private world. We spent entire summers up there, telling ghost stories, playing games, and sometimes even sleeping overnight, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was the perfect childhood escape. But when I was 13, something happened that made us abandon it forever. We never talked about it, never acknowledged it, and as we grew up, it became one of those childhood memories you shove into the deepest corners of your mind. But then, after nearly 20 years, I had to go back. My father had passed, and my mom needed help packing up the old house to sell it. Ethan lived across the country and couldn't make it, so it was just me, alone in a house that no longer felt like home. For the first few days, I stayed busy sorting through years of memories, boxing up old clothes and furniture. But on the third evening, as the sun started dipping behind the trees, I found myself walking toward the woods. Maybe it was nostalgia, maybe just curiosity, or maybe something else entirely. The old trail leading to the treehouse was still there, though overgrown and barely visible. My feet carried me forward instinctively, as if I had never left. And then there it was. The treehouse was still standing. That didn't make sense. After 20 years, the wood should have rotted, the boards should have collapsed under their own weight. But it looked intact, almost untouched by time. The ladder was still in place, the door slightly ajar, swaying with the breeze. My stomach twisted as an eerie sense of familiarity and wrongness settled over me. Something wasn't right. But still, I climbed up, half expecting the wood to snap beneath me. It didn't. The air inside was thick, stale, carrying the scent of dust and damp wood. Everything was exactly the same. Our old sleeping bags were still crumpled in the corner. A deck of playing cards sat in a neat pile on the floor. Even the half-melted candle we had used for ghost stories was still sitting on the small wooden ledge by the window. My breath caught in my throat. None of this should still be here. My dad would have torn it down years ago. No kids had played in this thing since we left. It should have been a rotting, broken ruin. Then I saw it. A name carved into the wood, scratched deep into the wall. Mark. I frowned. Ethan and I had carved our names into this exact spot when we were kids. But this wasn't ours. Someone else had added this. And underneath, in jagged, desperate letters, were two words that sent a wave of cold through my body. Help me. A gust of wind rattled the structure, and suddenly I felt it. That overwhelming sensation of being watched. I turned quickly, scanning the corners of the treehouse, but it was empty. Still, the air felt wrong, as if something unseen was sitting there waiting. My heart pounded as I moved toward the trapdoor to climb back down, only to find it closed. I hadn't closed it. A sudden, sharp whisper broke the silence, and I swear to God, it came from inside the treehouse with me. Josh, you came back. The voice was distorted, scratched, as if it came from someone who had been screaming for so long that their throat had turned to raw, shredded meat. A surge of terror gripped me, and I didn't hesitate. I threw myself at the trapdoor, shoving it open so hard I nearly fell off the ladder. My foot slipped, and I hit the ground hard, pain shooting up my leg, but I didn't stop. I ran through the trees, lungs burning, my mind racing with fragmented memories of a night I had tried to forget for years. The night Ethan and I were forced out of that treehouse. The night we heard the scratching under the floorboards. The night we heard the breathing that wasn't ours. I reached the back porch, slamming the door behind me, locking it 3 times before stepping away. My chest was heaving, my body trembling. But just as I turned from the window, something caught my eye in the yard. At the edge of the trees, standing beneath the treehouse, was a tall figure, watching me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every sound in the old house made me jump. I kept seeing shadows moving outside, but every time I looked, the yard was empty. By morning, I convinced myself that my mind had played tricks on me. But before I left town, something pushed me to go to the local library, to dig into old records. It took hours, but eventually I found it. A missing person report, 1994. A boy named Mark Evans. Last seen playing in the woods behind his house, just a few houses down from mine. His body was never found. The case had gone cold. A cold dread settled over me. The name scratched into the treehouse. The plea for help. The thing that whispered my name. It all clicked into place like a horrifying puzzle I had ignored for years. That treehouse? It was never really ours. The last thing I did before leaving town was go back one final time. Maybe it was stupidity, maybe some part of me needed closure. The treehouse still stood, silent and unchanged, as if time refused to touch it. I climbed up slowly, breath shallow, every step heavy with dread. I reached the top and looked inside. And there, in the dust-covered floorboards, were new words carved into the wood. "Thank you, Josh." The air in the treehouse felt thicker, like something was standing right behind me. I left without looking back. I never told Ethan. I never told anyone. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up with that same feeling of being watched. And when I look out my bedroom window, no matter where I am, I swear, I can still see the treehouse, waiting. I never believed in ghosts. I never thought much about the things that lurk in the dark, the whispers people claim to hear when they're alone, or the shadows that move just out of sight. But that was before I spent the longest, most horrifying night of my life in a treehouse that should not have existed. I was 29 years old when it happened. My friend Connor had just inherited an old property in rural Pennsylvania from his grandfather. It was deep in the woods, miles from any main road, the kind of place where the trees pressed in so tightly that even in daylight, the world felt dim and claustrophobic. The house was ancient, the wood dark with age, but it was sturdy. Connor invited me and a few friends up for the weekend, mostly to drink, mess around, and pretend we were kids again. It was supposed to be a fun escape from reality. That first night, after a few drinks, Connor brought up the treehouse. "I swear it wasn't there when I came up last month," he said, frowning. "It's old though. Looks like it's been there for decades." We all laughed, assuming he was just drunk, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He wasn't making it up. So, of course, we decided to check it out. It was only a short walk from the house, but the deeper we moved into the trees, the quieter everything became. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind barely rustled the leaves. A heavy, unnatural silence settled around us, and I felt my stomach tighten. When we reached it, the treehouse loomed above, barely visible in the dark. It was massive, far bigger than a normal treehouse should have been. The wood was old, almost blackened, as if it had been through a fire. The ladder was still intact, though it looked ready to crumble under our weight. Connor laughed nervously. "See? Told you. No way this thing just popped up." I stared at it, my skin crawling. There was something wrong about it, something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to turn back. But of course, we climbed up anyway. Inside, the space was surprisingly large, but empty. The air was thick, damp, carrying the scent of rotting wood and something else, something I couldn't place. Something foul. The only thing inside was a small, old wooden chair in the center of the room. It was positioned directly under a hole in the ceiling, a perfect square that led to what looked like a second level. "There's an upstairs?" Connor muttered. But there was no ladder. No way to reach it. Maybe it collapsed. I offered, but my voice sounded strange, almost hollow in the quiet space. Then from above we heard it, a slow creak, like someone shifting their weight. We all froze. Then footsteps. Deliberate. Heavy. Moving directly above us. Connor turned pale. "Guys, we need to go." We scrambled for the exit, shoving at each other to get out first. But as I reached the opening, I made the mistake of looking back. The chair was no longer under the hole. It had been moved. And directly beneath it, something had been carved into the wood. "Don't look up!" A loud thud came from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of something crawling. I didn't think. I jumped. I landed hard, pain shooting up my leg, but I didn't stop. I ran. We all did, tearing through the trees like hunted animals. Back in the house, we locked the doors, panting, too scared to speak. No one wanted to say it, but we all had the same thought. Someone or something was up there, and it had been watching us. That night, we barely slept. Every creak of the house made me flinch. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of Connor pacing in the hallway, whispering to himself. I got up, still rattled, and as I stepped closer, I realized Connor wasn't alone. There was a voice whispering back. Low, crooked, wrong. I reached out, grabbed his arm. Connor, who are you talking to? He turned to me, his face pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. His lips parted, but before he could answer, we heard it. A thud. On the roof. A long, dragging sound, like fingernails scraping across the shingles. Then from outside, from deep in the woods, a voice called out. Come back up. Not a shout. Not a demand. A mocking whisper. Like it already knew we would. Connor broke. He started screaming, backing away from the door, shaking his head. I dragged him away, slamming his bedroom door shut. We left at sunrise. We didn't pack. We didn't talk. We just got in the car and drove away. Later, Connor told me something that made my blood run cold. That night, when he was whispering in the hallway, he wasn't sleepwalking. He wasn't confused. He was listening to the thing calling his name from the ceiling. We never spoke about that night again. Connor sold the property a few months later, refusing to ever set foot near those woods again. I still don't know who built that treehouse, why it was there, or how it seemed to appear out of nowhere. But I do know one thing. If you ever find an old, abandoned treehouse in the middle of nowhere, one that shouldn't exist, don't go inside. And for the love of God, don't look up. Growing up, I always envied my cousins. They had this massive old house deep in the countryside, surrounded by endless acres of trees, the kind of place that felt like a different world. It wasn't just the house, though. What really made me jealous was the treehouse. It sat high in a huge oak tree, right at the edge of the woods behind their house. It was big, bigger than any treehouse I had ever seen. Sturdy wooden walls, a peaked roof, a trapdoor with a rope ladder. It had 2 windows, one facing the house, the other looking out toward the deep woods. My uncle had built it for them when they were kids, and though it was starting to age, it still looked solid. But for some reason, they never used it. I was 12 the first time I asked about it. My cousin Jake, who was a year older than me, just shrugged. Dad says it's not safe anymore. But that didn't make sense. The structure looked fine. And even though my uncle never forbade us from going up, my cousins always avoided it. By the time I was 14, I was obsessed with that treehouse. Every summer, when I visited, I'd catch myself staring at it from the porch, wondering why no one used it, why my cousins never even talked about it. One afternoon, while my cousins were busy, I decided to go up alone. The rope ladder was stiff, the wood creaking under my weight, but it held. Inside, the air was thick and stale, filled with the scent of dust and damp wood. Sunlight streamed through the window facing the house, illuminating the old wooden floor, the graffiti of childhood carvings covering the walls. Names, doodles, dates. Some were old, going back decades. Then I saw it. A name scratched deep into the wood, unlike the others. Eric. My own name. I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't done that. My cousins wouldn't have either. I knelt down, running my fingers over the carved letters, my stomach twisting. Beneath my name, in jagged, uneven writing, were 2 words. Turn around. A gust of wind rattled the walls, and I felt it, a sudden, overwhelming sense that I was not alone. Slowly, I turned toward the window that faced the woods. And my breath caught in my throat. There was a face staring at me. Pale. Hollow. Pressed against the glass from the outside. I screamed. I don't remember climbing down. 1 second, I was in the treehouse. The next, I was running toward the house, my lungs burning, my mind screaming that what I saw wasn't possible. The treehouse was high off the ground. There was no balcony, no platform, nothing for someone to be standing on. When I told my uncle what I had seen, his face darkened. My cousin sat in tense silence, staring at the table. That was when he told me about the boy who went missing. It happened years before my uncle bought the house, back in the 1970s. The previous owners had a son, a boy named Elliot, who was around 10 years old. He spent all of his time in the treehouse. It was his favorite place in the world, until one day he just vanished. His parents swore he had been playing in the treehouse that afternoon. They called for him at dinner, no answer. By nightfall, the entire town was out searching. They never found him. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading away. It was like he had simply ceased to exist. Then, a week after he went missing, his mother went up to the treehouse one last time. And that's when she saw it. A new name carved into the wood. Elliot. Scratched into the wall, right below the other children's names. Just like mine had been. My uncle looked at me with serious eyes. "You need to stay out of that treehouse, Eric." I nodded. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. At 3 a.m., I woke up gasping for air. A sound had pulled me from my sleep. A slow, rhythmic creaking. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside the window. Creak, creak, creak. I recognized that sound. It was wood shifting under weight, like someone moving inside the treehouse. I held my breath, barely daring to move. The house was silent. My cousins were asleep. My uncle's bedroom door was shut. I forced myself to look out the window, and I saw it. The window of the treehouse was open. A shape stood inside, barely visible in the shadows. Watching. A slow, pale hand reached up and pressed against the glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then in one slow motion it lifted its other hand and pointed at me. My vision blurred. My lungs ached. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I remember was waking up to daylight, still sitting upright in bed, my body drenched in sweat. The first thing I did was run outside. The treehouse window was closed, but there was something new. My name, carved into the outside wall of the treehouse, high up where no human could reach. Eric. I packed my bags and left that day. I never went back. Years later, I found an old newspaper article online about the missing boy. It included a photo of Elliot. My stomach twisted into a cold knot, because I recognized the face. I had seen it, staring at me through the window. That treehouse? It never belonged to us, and I think whoever built it never meant for anyone to leave.